Okay, we'll read number 6. Brian?
Sure, okay. 6. If fascism succeeds like a battering ram in smashing the workers' movement, then it has done its duty from the standpoint of monopoly capitalism. Its mass movement is bureaucratized and to a large extent assimilated into the bourgeois state apparatus. This cannot occur unless the most extreme forms of the plebeian, petty bourgeois demagoguery present in the goals of the movement disappear from view and are removed from the official ideology. This development is by no means opposed to the continuing tendency of the highly centralized state apparatus to become independent. For once the workers' movement is vanquished, and the conditions of the production and realization of surplus value have been decisively altered domestically to the advantage of the big bourgeoisie, then efforts will necessarily be concentrated on bringing about a similar change on the world market. The all-or-nothing politics of fascism are carried over from the social, political sphere into the financial sphere. It encourages permanent inflation and finally allows no alternative but foreign military adventure, imperialism. But this whole development brings with it deterioration rather than improvement in the economic situation, a consequence of the war economy, and in the political position of the petty bourgeoisie, with the exception of that part that can be fed with sinecures from the increasingly independent state apparatus. Instead of, quote, liberation from the coils of usury capital, unquote, a pronounced acceleration in the concentration of capital and the proletarianization of the middle class takes place. This fact demonstrates the class character of the fascist dictatorship, which does not correspond to that of the fascist movement. The former represents the historical interest of monopoly capital, not those of the petty bourgeoisie. Once this tendency becomes predominant, the conscious and active mass base of fascism necessarily shrinks. The fascist dictatorship has the tendency to undermine and disintegrate its own mass base. The fascist bands become appendages of the police. In the phase of its decline, fascism is transformed back into a particular kind of Bonapartism. These are the constituent elements of Trotsky's theory of fascism. On the one hand, it is based on an analysis of the special conditions under which the class struggle develops in highly industrialized countries during the late capitalist structural crisis. Trotsky himself spoke of the epoch of capitalist decay. On the other hand, it flows from a particular way, peculiar to Trotsky's Marxism, of relating the objective and subjective factors in the practical course of this class struggle and in the theoretical interpretation of it.
Okay, so he's talking here after Hitler seized power, Mussolini seized power. They seized power using a mass base of middle class, petty bourgeois, the term they uses, including armed bands, hooligans, roughnecks, whatever. Brown shirts, that's right, they call them the SA. No, it wasn't the police. These were outside the police. These were extra legal. They were militias. Well, that's something we're talking about Hitler now. But he said this is an important distinction because once he used the petty bourgeoisie to get into power, fascism now becomes the tool that it was originally used by those who were paying the bill. And it had to basically destroy this base that he had built up, because now you control the government. So you bring some of them into the government, those you want. Sinecures is just another word for like a paid position. But Hitler literally massacred the SA, the stormtroopers.
He did?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
The SA was destroyed in 1934. A year or two, year and a half after seizing power, they murdered in a bloodbath the leadership and the leading elements and disbanded the SA, the brown shirts. They replaced them with a militarized police force where they brought the more discipline. But you know, there's the ones gone mad, the lunatic fringe that some of these Tea Party, those people can't be incorporated in. They're too crazy. They knew that. They were good for smashing strikes and breaking up meetings like this, but they destroyed them, liquidated them, but they didn't need them anymore because you're in government. Now you got the tax base, the military, you got all the guns you ever want. Now you just draft people and you draft workers who don't want to fight back because they're demoralized, and they give, so they were able to establish what he calls a Bonapartist state, and that's just almost like a military dictatorship. It's no longer fascism after fascism succeeds. Because now you don't need the mass base anymore, you just repress everyone using classical, including your own followers.
Yes, you kill them all.
Including your own followers, yes.
I got one question before I leave. I have to go to work. I love this conversation, but do you think, and I'm just asking personally, people like Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, those who were assassinated, this was to protect the status quo?
I do believe that. I think most of the people in the country believe that Kennedy was killed for the same reason by the ultra-right sections of the ruling class. And yeah, and there's quite a few of them up there in the government power who just love Ku Klux Klanism.
J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah, there are quite a few, but
so,
they don't run everything now because it's cheaper, and they're kept in the background because it's
fascist job.
Thank you.
I hope to join
you.
Okay, all right, very good, buddy.
Thank you.
All right, well, good. Thanks for coming. We'll see you again.
Very good.
Is everyone on the email list?
And by the way, next week we have a meeting here on the
Lee's murder of Ayanna Jones.
yeah.
Oh, that's gonna be hot.
7 o'clock.
Okay.
7 o'clock. Special meeting.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay,
Gotta go
take
to my
care.
fashion job.
Okay. And that's an important thing. Once it's become established, then it's just that doesn't mean it became any nicer. That's when they started systematically killing the millions. It's just that their mass base, they dropped talking about monopoly capitalism and social. They dropped all that from the ideology. Now it was, and then they you needed to generate the World War because Germany still needed to capture more territory for its markets. If folks want to, well, that's 7, so we've been at this almost 2 hours. There is a second section here from later in the book that Trotsky wrote about the petty bourgeoisie, showing I'm going to summarize this, read it on your own.
Yes.
The bourgeoisie, the petty, and the proletariat. And he describes how there were 3 historical periods where the ruling class is always a small class. And I mean, until the workers take over, it will be. It's a very small, and the big capitalist class is always very small. They always need a broader base to rule, to do their work with. The first phase was the time when the capitalists challenged the feudal nobility, the kings and the nobility, in the Middle Ages and especially the French Revolution. They needed to smash them, and then they went to war with all of Europe and England. It's, you know, this whole thing, when in 1789, Napoleon, I don't want to go into all of that. But there was a period, but then they used the petty bourgeoisie in a revolutionary manner, and that corresponded with what they call the Jacobin period, and names like Robespierre and Danton, who smashed, who annihilated, killed several thousand nobility with the guillotine, took dictatorial measures in their hands, and the capitalists who they were doing this for weren't happy with that, but they stepped aside to let them do it because it had to be done for the capitalists to defeat the nobility. That was the progressive phase. The Jacobins were, you know, revolutionary. Let me just touch the third. The second phase was the stable middle period, the late 1800s, where another petty bourgeois strata, the socialist bureaucracy of the parties, the socialist parties, they kept a lid on the workers' movement by being pretty moderate. And so he talks about them as being a petty bourgeois strata that trade union leaders, we see it now, trade union leaders are bending over backwards, and they are keeping a lid on the workers' movement, and that's in a more peaceful period that works. And then and he characterizes them as a petty bourgeois strata, not the whole workers, but just that leadership that becomes well-paid, overpaid, and too conservative. And then the third period, the petty bourgeois movement under fascism. So you can read that.